All right, hun, don't worry. I have everything under control. And a moment from now, everything will be in our favor.
It was 6:42 in the evening when someone noticed the bride had stepped outside and hadn't come back. Not immediately. At first, it was just a quiet observation. The kind that doesn't interrupt anything. The kind that waits to see if it matters. Because weddings are full of small disappearances. A bridesmaid fixing her dress. A guest taking a phone call. Someone stepping away to breathe. And Emily Carter had been calm all day. Unusually calm. So when she slipped out through the side door of the reception hall, no one followed. No one questioned it. Not yet. The music continued. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed a little too loudly near the bar. Everything kept moving exactly as it should. Until 10 minutes passed. Then 20. And somewhere between those two moments, something shifted. Not loudly. Not suddenly. Just enough for people to start noticing what wasn't happening. Because the bride wasn't coming back. And then someone saw it. Her phone. Still sitting on the table. Screen lit. Unlocked. As if it had been left there on purpose. The venue sat just outside Asheville. Tucked between low hills and narrow roads that curved more than they needed to. It was the kind of place people described as peaceful, quiet, private. Emily had chosen it herself. And that mattered. Because Emily didn't leave things to chance. Not small things. Not big things. Not even things most people wouldn't think twice about. She planned everything. Carefully. Precisely. Almost too precisely. And that's what made the timing feel strange. Because if there was one thing everyone agreed on later, it was this. Nothing about that day felt out of place. Not the ceremony. Not the vows. Not even Emily herself. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look overwhelmed. If anything, she looked like someone following a plan she already understood. Step by step. Exactly as expected. It was one of the bridesmaids who finally picked it up. Not out of panic. Out of instinct. The screen hadn't gone dark yet. And when she looked down, she froze. Not dramatically. Not in a way that drew attention. Just still. As if her brain needed a second longer than usual to process what she was seeing. Then she read it again. Quietly. Almost to herself. I waited longer than I should have. I'm not waiting anymore. No name. No emoji. No explanation. Just that. And for a moment, it didn't feel like a message. It felt like a continuation of something no one else had heard. And moments like that, the quiet ones that don't make sense right away, tend to matter more than we expect. Before we go further, if you've been following stories like this on Chaos of Lives, let us know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, take a moment to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because this story doesn't move in a straight line. Emily met Daniel Brooks 4 years earlier. Not at a bar. Not through an app. Through people. Which usually makes things feel more trustworthy. It was a dinner in Raleigh. 8 people. Nothing memorable about it. At least not at the time. Daniel noticed her because she listened more than she spoke. Emily noticed him because he didn't try too hard. And that was enough. They started seeing each other casually. Then regularly. Then seriously. And if you asked anyone who knew them, they would have said the same thing. It made sense. Daniel was steady. Predictable in a way that felt safe. An engineer who liked structure, routine, things that held together. Emily fit into that structure almost perfectly. Almost. Because there was something about her that people couldn't quite describe. Not suspicious. Not alarming. Just incomplete. Emily didn't talk much about where she came from. Not because she refused, but because she redirected. Smoothly. Effortlessly. If someone asked about her childhood, she'd smile and shift the focus. If someone mentioned family, she'd respond, but never expand. And over time, people adjusted. Because everything else about her seemed so complete. Organized. Reliable. Present. Until you looked too closely. When Daniel proposed, there wasn't hesitation. There wasn't even surprise. Emily said yes, immediately. And within days. She had already started planning the wedding. Not discussing. Not imagining. Planning. Venue. Guest list. Timeline. Down to the minute. And then there was one detail Daniel never quite understood. A 10-minute gap in the schedule. Right after the ceremony. No explanation. Just space. When he asked about it, Emily smiled and said, "It's just something I need." The night before the wedding didn't feel unusual. That's what everyone said later. Nothing stood out. No arguments. No visible stress. No last-minute panic. If anything, Emily seemed more relaxed than expected. There was a small dinner with close friends. Nothing formal. Just conversation, soft music, people trying to keep things light before the next day. Emily smiled when she needed to. She listened. She responded. But there were moments, short ones, that didn't quite match the rest. Moments where she seemed slightly elsewhere. Not distracted. Just ahead. As if she was already in tomorrow. Or maybe past it. It was around 9:18 p.m. when her phone rang. One of the bridesmaids remembered the exact time. Not because it mattered then, but because of how Emily reacted. She didn't ignore it. She didn't silence it. She looked at the screen and stood up immediately. No hesitation. No explanation. She stepped outside. And for a while, no one followed. At weddings, people respect space. They assume privacy. They assume everything is fine. Until it isn't. The air that night was cool, but not cold. Quiet enough that voices carried, if you were close enough. One of the bridesmaids stepped out a few minutes later, not intentionally listening, just needing air herself. She didn't hear the full conversation. Just fragments. Emily's voice. Low. Controlled. Not emotional. Not surprised. That was the part that stood out later. She didn't sound shocked. She didn't sound confused. She sounded like someone confirming something that had already been decided. And at one point, clearly enough to remember, she said,
Then tomorrow is the only day it works.
When Emily came back in, nothing about her appearance had changed. No tears, no tension, no visible shift. But her energy had settled. Not lighter, not heavier, just resolved. Someone asked if everything was okay. She nodded, smiled, and said something simple. Everything's still on schedule. At the time, it sounded like reassurance. Later, it sounded like confirmation. The next day unfolded exactly as planned. Hair, makeup, photos, timing, everything aligned. Even the smallest details, things most people wouldn't notice, were executed perfectly. Emily didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She moved through each moment with quiet certainty. And when the ceremony began at exactly 6:00 p.m., she walked down the aisle like someone who had already seen the ending. Not nervous, not emotional, just steady. There was one moment Daniel would later come back to again and again. It happened just before the ceremony. They had a few minutes alone. Nothing unusual, just a pause before everything began. And Emily looked at him, not nervously, not intensely, just directly. And she asked, "If something unexpected happens today, would you still believe me?" It didn't sound dramatic. It didn't sound like a warning. If anything, it sounded hypothetical, almost casual. Daniel laughed slightly. Of course he would. Why wouldn't he? But Emily didn't laugh. She just nodded, as if his answer had already been expected. Back at the reception, time was still moving forward. But now it felt different. Measured. Watched. The kind of time that doesn't pass unnoticed anymore. People had started checking places they normally wouldn't. Outside areas. Hallways. Parking sections. At first, it was quiet. Then coordinated. Then urgent. But still controlled. Because no one wanted to say it out loud yet. Not fully. Not in a way that made it real. It was one of the venue staff who noticed the car. Parked slightly away from the main lot. Far enough to be missed at first glance. Close enough to belong there. The engine was off. The door wasn't locked. And inside, everything looked intentional. Not abandoned. Not rushed. Placed. On the passenger seat. A small envelope. When they opened it, there wasn't much inside. Just a single sheet of paper. Folded once. And a name written clearly on the front. Michael Hayes. No one at the wedding recognized it. Not Daniel. Not the bridesmaids. Not her co-workers. Which made it feel out of place. Like something that belonged to a different version of her life. By the time authorities were contacted, the story had already started to change. Because this was no longer just about a missing bride. There were now patterns, details, connections that didn't align with the version of Emily everyone thought they knew. And for the first time, a question began to take shape. Not about where she went, but about who she had been before any of this started. At first, Michael Hayes was just a name, a detail that didn't fit. But details like that don't stay small for long, especially when everything else begins to revolve around them. Authorities didn't take long to run it, and what came back wasn't dramatic. It wasn't shocking in the way people expect stories like this to be. It was quiet. A record. 6 years earlier, a missing persons report filed in Ohio. The person reported missing, Emily Hayes. The timeline didn't make sense right away. It had to be checked, confirmed, matched against what people already knew. Because according to everything Daniel and everyone else believed, Emily Carter had always been Emily Carter. No gaps, no interruptions, no second version. But records don't adjust themselves to match what people believe. They stay where they are. And this one didn't move. Emily Hayes. Married. Last known residence, Columbus, Ohio. Spouse, Michael Hayes. Status, missing. The question wasn't just what happened. It was how no one had noticed. Because Emily hadn't lived in isolation. She had built a life. Friends. Work. A relationship. Years of consistency. So how does someone leave one life and construct another without anything slipping? The answer wasn't complicated. It was gradual, careful, and very, very deliberate. 6 years earlier, Emily Hayes had disappeared. Not violently, not suddenly, just gone. Her car was found. Her belongings were mostly intact. No clear signs of struggle. No explanation. Michael Hayes had reported her missing. Search efforts followed. Questions were asked. And then, over time, everything slowed. Because cases like that often do. Without evidence, without direction, they fade. Not completely, but enough. Emily hadn't been taken. She hadn't been lost. She had left. Quietly. Intentionally. And more importantly, alone. What she left behind wasn't chaos. It was absence. The kind that doesn't explain itself. The kind that forces everyone else to fill in the blanks. If she had managed to leave successfully, if she had built something new, why risk it? Why return to something that had already been closed? Because that's what this was starting to look like. Not an escape. Not a disappearance. A return. The call the night before the wedding wasn't random. It wasn't unexpected. It wasn't even unwanted. It was inevitable. Michael had found her. Not through luck. Not through coincidence. But through time. Because people who disappear don't just vanish from memory. They stay somewhere. And eventually, something connects. A name. A record. A trace. And once it does, it doesn't stop. That's space in the wedding schedule. The one Daniel never understood was never about logistics. It was never about photos. It was never about timing. It was a window. A moment Emily created, knowing she would need it. Because she knew he would come. Not exactly when. Not exactly how. But soon enough. And the wedding gave him something he didn't have before. A place. A time. A certainty. They found her just over an hour later. Not far from the venue. Near a narrow road that curved out toward the hills. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was sitting. Waiting. Calm in the same way she had been all day. When they approached her, she didn't resist. She didn't panic. She just stood up. As if the moment she had planned for had finally arrived. Michael arrived not long after. And when he did, there wasn't shouting. There wasn't anger in the way people expect. There was something quieter. Something heavier. Recognition. 6 years of absence, meeting in a single moment. Emily didn't deny who she was. She didn't try to continue the version of herself she had built. Because she knew that version couldn't exist anymore. Not now. Not with both lives colliding in the same place. Emily hadn't left because of one single event. There wasn't one moment to point to. No simple explanation. Her previous life hadn't collapsed. It hadn't exploded. It had narrowed. Slowly. Until leaving felt like the only way to expand again. So she did. She stepped out of it. And kept going. Until she became someone else. That was the part she couldn't escape. You can leave a life. But if you don't end it, it stays open. Waiting. And eventually, it catches up. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just inevitably. The wedding wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad timing. It wasn't unfortunate. It was the point where everything became irreversible. Because marriage would have made her new life permanent in a way the old one still legally wasn't. And somewhere, whether she admitted it or not. She knew that, so she didn't run from the moment. She built it, carefully, step by step, until both versions of her life arrived at the same place. At the same time, Daniel didn't get the version of the story he expected. There was no clear betrayal, no simple lie, because Emily had been honest, just not complete. And sometimes, that's harder to process. He later said the hardest part wasn't losing her. It was realizing she had been real. Every conversation, every plan, every moment, just not the whole truth. Emily didn't disappear that night. Not really. She stopped dividing herself. That's all. The version of her that had been living two lives couldn't continue. So it ended, quietly, in the same controlled way everything else had unfolded. And maybe that's what makes stories like this stay with people. Not the disappearance, not the reveal, but the realization that everything felt normal, right up until it didn't. And by then, it had already been happening for much longer than anyone realized.